The front door opened at 7:43 on Christmas Eve, and my husband walked in with another woman. I know the exact time because I had been watching the clock for 40 minutes, the particular kind of watching you do when someone is late to something they promised they would not be late to, when the lateness itself carries a specific weight that ordinary lateness doesn't have. Our family's Christmas Eve dinner started at 7. Marcus had texted at 6:58 to say he was 5 minutes away. By 7:43, I had refreshed that text message 4 times without responding to it, and my mother had twice suggested that we simply begin without him, and I had twice said no, because some part of me already understood, in the way that you understand things before you're willing to know them consciously, that whatever was happening with Marcus's 43 minutes of unexplained delay was something I needed to be sitting down for when it arrived. I was sitting down. Everyone was sitting down, actually, my mother, my father, my brother James, my Aunt Carol and her husband, my cousin Stephanie, all arranged around the dining table that my parents had extended with the additional leaf they only brought out for gatherings of this size, the table set with the Christmas dishes that had been in our family for 30 years, candles lit, food keeping warm in the kitchen, the particular festive arrangement of a dinner party that had been waiting too long and had developed, in the waiting, a slightly exhausted quality. The front door opened. My mother, who was seated with her back to the hallway, looked at me first, the reflexive maternal attention that reads a daughter's face before processing any other information in the room. What she saw in my face made her turn around. Marcus came through the door wearing the coat I'd bought him for his birthday, the charcoal wool one he'd said he loved and had worn almost every day since October. Beside him, her arm through his with the specific, practiced ease of someone who had been performing this particular gesture for long enough that it no longer required conscious thought, was a woman I had never seen before. She was perhaps 30, a few years younger than me. She had dark hair and she was wearing a red dress that was slightly too formal for what she apparently expected this to be, and she was smiling the smile of someone who has been told a situation is one thing and has not yet received sufficient information to understand it is another thing entirely. Marcus stopped when he saw the table. He had expected, I understood immediately, that I would be alone or nearly alone, that the Christmas Eve dinner I had described to him when I'd reminded him about it 3 days ago, then again that morning, had been a smaller, more private affair than the 11-person gathering that was currently staring at him from across a table set with 30-year-old Christmas dishes and 3 inches of accumulated silence. You said it was just family, he said, which was, of all the sentences available to him in that moment, one of the most revealing choices he could have made, because it confirmed, without any further interrogation, that he had been told about this dinner and had chosen to bring someone to it anyway, under the assumption that just family meant something manageable. I want to take you back, before I tell you what happened next, because the story of that front door opening at 7:43 on Christmas Eve is not a story that starts at 7:43 on Christmas Eve. It starts considerably earlier, in the specific, accumulated way that most stories of this kind start, through a series of moments that individually were deniable and collectively were not. My name is Sarah. I had been married to Marcus for 7 years, and the marriage had been, for most of those 7 years, something I would have described as good, not perfect, not without the ordinary friction of 2 people sharing a life in close proximity, but good in the specific, substantive way of a relationship built on genuine compatibility and mutual respect and the accumulated comfort of knowing someone well enough to finish their sentences and anticipate their moods. The first 2 years had been genuinely wonderful, in the clear, uncomplicated way that first years sometimes are when 2 people are well matched enough that the novelty of each other and the actual quality of the relationship are operating simultaneously. We had met through mutual friends at a birthday party, discovered that we had enough in common to sustain conversation for 3 hours without noticing the time, and been together continuously from that evening forward with the easy momentum of something that wants to happen. Marcus was charming in the specific way that some men are charming, not performatively, not with the obvious, practice quality of someone deploying charm as a strategy, but naturally, the way that people who are genuinely interested in other people are charming without trying. He remembered details. He asked follow-up questions. He made people feel, in his company, like the most interesting version of themselves. It was this quality, I would eventually understand, that made everything that followed not only possible but perhaps inevitable, because a man who makes everyone feel like the most interesting version of themselves is not a man who limits that quality to the specific context of his marriage. I should tell you about my brother James before I tell you what happened at the table, because James is the reason this story ends the way it does rather than the way it might otherwise have ended. James is 2 years older than me, 36 at the time of that Christmas Eve, and our relationship has always been characterized by the specific, uncomplicated closeness of two people who have always been primarily each other's people in the way that siblings sometimes are when they are genuinely compatible as human beings rather than simply related by accident of birth. He had liked Marcus, initially. He had been at our wedding, had given a speech that made half the room cry, had been present and warm and genuinely enthusiastic about the marriage in ways that I had found genuinely meaningful, because James's approval was not something he extended carelessly and his withholding of it was equally legible. What had changed between James and Marcus was something that had happened gradually and then, I think, more quickly, over the past 18 months or so. A cooling that I had observed without fully understanding its origin and had attributed, in my more generous moments, to the natural evolution of a brother-in-law relationship past its early, more effortful phase. I had not understood, until considerably later, that James had noticed things I hadn't allowed myself to fully notice, and that his cooling toward Marcus had been a response to what he was seeing rather than simply the passage of time. He had mentioned Marcus once, about 8 months before that Christmas Eve, in a conversation we'd had over dinner when Marcus was traveling for work. He had said, with the careful restraint of someone who has chosen their words with particular precision, "I hope you're paying attention to things, Sarah. I don't want to say more than that right now. But I hope you're paying attention." I had asked him what he meant. He had said he wasn't certain enough to say more, that he might be wrong, that he didn't want to put something in my head that turned out to be nothing. I had pushed, gently. He had held his position, gently. We had moved on. I had thought about that conversation several times in the months that followed, turning it over in the way you turn over something you don't entirely understand, retrieving it occasionally when something small occurred that felt slightly off, then replacing it when nothing definitive materialized. 8 months later, the front door opened. Marcus stood in the hallway with the woman in the red dress and said, "You said it was just family," and James, who was sitting to my left at the table, went completely still in the specific way he goes still when he is making a decision, when he is moving through some internal process and has not yet arrived at its conclusion. I was not still. I was the opposite of still. I was experiencing the particular, overwhelming sensation of many things happening simultaneously inside me, the specific chaos of understanding arriving at speed when it has been withheld for a long time. The woman's arm through Marcus's. The red dress. The particular way Marcus's expression had shifted from the easy confidence of someone executing a plan to something more complicated the moment he processed the size and composition of the room. My mother had turned back from looking at the doorway to looking at me, and her expression contained everything she had understood in the past 30 seconds assembled into a single look of maternal devastation on my behalf. My father was looking at Marcus with an expression I had seen on his face perhaps twice in my life, the specific, controlled expression of a man who is very angry and is managing that anger with the deliberateness of someone who understands that how he responds in the next few moments matters more than the anger itself. My Aunt Carol had put down her fork. Stephanie was looking at the woman in the red dress with the specific, forensic attention of someone cataloging information. The woman in the red dress had stopped smiling. And Marcus was looking at me with the expression of a man who has walked into a situation considerably more complicated than he anticipated and is doing rapid, insufficient calculations about how to proceed. Nobody spoke for what felt like a very long time. The candles on the table were still lit. The food was still keeping warm in the kitchen. The 30-year-old Christmas dishes were still arranged exactly as my mother had arranged them, because none of the physical details of the room had changed in the past 90 seconds even though everything else had. Then James pushed back his chair. He did it slowly, deliberately, with the specific unhurried quality of someone who has made a decision and is executing it without any of the urgency that might suggest either panic or anger. He stood up. He was taller than Marcus by perhaps 2 inches, a detail that had never previously been relevant and was suddenly, in the specific geometry of that hallway and that table and that moment, very present. He walked toward the hallway. He stopped approximately 3 feet from Marcus. And in the complete, absolute silence of a room where 11 people had collectively stopped breathing, James looked at my husband and said 5 words. I need to tell you the 5 words before I tell you the backstory, because I suspect most of you are still sitting with the question of what they were, and I think withholding them through an entire section of backstory would be more frustrating than illuminating. James looked at my husband, standing in the hallway with another woman on Christmas Eve, and said, "Get out of this house." That was it. 5 words. No raised voice. No dramatic gesture. No additional language to fill in the weight of the moment, because the weight of the moment needed no filling, it was already complete, already sufficient, already carrying everything that needed to be carried by the specific combination of James's stillness and his voice and the absolute clarity of what he was saying. I want to describe the specific quality of how he said it, because I think it matters. He didn't shout. He didn't whisper. He used the particular register of someone who has decided that the situation requires not volume but certainty, the voice of someone who is not asking a question or issuing a suggestion but stating, with complete finality, a fact about how the next few moments were going to proceed regardless of anyone else's preferences. Marcus stared at him. The woman in the red dress looked between James and Marcus with the specific expression of someone who has just understood that they have been brought into a situation that was described to them inaccurately and that the inaccuracy is now, in real time, becoming apparent. I will come back to what happened immediately after the 5 words, because there is more to tell about those next few minutes. But first I need to take you back, because the 5 words and the Christmas Eve and the woman in the red dress don't make complete sense without the 18 months that preceded them. The cheating, as best I have been able to reconstruct it, began approximately 2 years before that Christmas Eve, though I am not entirely certain of this timeline because the reconstruction depends partly on things Marcus eventually told me and partly on things I figured out independently, and Marcus's account of the timeline was, I have reason to believe, compressed in ways that served his own comfort rather than accuracy. What I knew, going into the 3rd year of that 18-month period of sustained not knowing, was a collection of small things that individually were explainable and collectively produced a persistent, low-grade discomfort that I had learned to manage rather than confront. A phone that was suddenly always face down on surfaces where it had previously been face up. Not dramatically, not as though a decision had been made to hide it, but gradually, the way that habits shift when someone is managing information they don't want passively visible. A change in his relationship with his phone more broadly, more attentive to it, quicker to respond to messages, occasionally leaving the room to take calls in a way that had previously not been his pattern. Work travel that increased in frequency and slightly in duration, with explanations that were always individually plausible and collectively added up to more absence than his job, as far as I understood it, actually required. A quality in his attention to me that shifted, subtly, over this period, not becoming cold exactly, but becoming slightly more managed, as though he was now consciously maintaining something he had previously simply felt, the specific effort of someone performing a version of their former self. I noticed all of these things. I want to be clear about that, because I think there is sometimes an implication, in stories like this, that the partner who didn't know must not have been paying attention, and I was paying attention. I simply had not yet arrived at the specific point at which accumulating evidence becomes an accusation you're willing to make. There were reasons for this that I understand better now than I did then. I had been in a relationship before Marcus that had ended partly because I had accused my then-boyfriend of cheating based on a pattern of behavior that turned out to have an entirely innocent explanation, and the specific, lasting damage of that false accusation, to the relationship, to my own understanding of my own judgment, had produced in me a calibrated wariness about reaching conclusions from circumstantial evidence that I think, in retrospect, I had overcorrected for. I was also, simply, not ready. Not ready to look at 7 years of marriage and acknowledge that it had been operating on a version of reality that wasn't real, not ready to dismantle something that still functioned, on its surface, as a life I recognized and valued, even if the foundation was no longer what I believed it to be. James had been more ready than I was to see clearly. He had told me, those 8 months before Christmas Eve, that he hoped I was paying attention, and then he had waited, which was the right thing to do. He understood that the information he suspected would be more useful to me when I arrived at it through my own process rather than having it delivered, and that his role was not to force a confrontation I wasn't ready for but to be present and available when I was. What James had noticed, specifically, was something he described to me fully only after Christmas Eve, in a conversation that assembled the picture I had been refusing to fully assemble. He had been at our house for dinner about 14 months before that Christmas, an ordinary weeknight where he and Marcus and I had cooked together and eaten and stayed up later than intended talking about the inconsequential things that people who are comfortable with each other talk about late on weeknight evenings. Marcus had received a text message sometime around 11, had glanced at it with a fraction of a second's delayed response before resuming the conversation, and James, who was sitting at an angle that gave him a partial view of Marcus's phone screen, had seen enough of the preview, a name, a tone, a single visible phrase, to understand that something was not right. He had not said anything that night. He had gone home and sat with what he had seen and had begun paying attention in the specific, quiet way that James pays attention when he has decided that a situation warrants it. Over the following months, he had noticed things from his vantage point as a regular presence in our lives that confirmed rather than contradicted his initial read, the face-down phone, which he also noticed, the slightly managed quality of Marcus's attention to me in group settings. A comment Marcus had made during a family gathering about being glad to finally have a weekend without travel that contradicted something he had told me about the same weekend. James had collected these fragments with the patient thoroughness of someone building a case they hope they're wrong about. He was not wrong. The specific incident that most clearly confirmed his suspicions, and that he described to me on that same post-Christmas Eve evening with the careful precision of someone who has been waiting to finally be able to say what he knows, happened at a family barbecue we'd hosted in the summer, approximately 5 months before Christmas. Marcus had stepped away from the party to take a phone call, which he had explained afterward as a work colleague dealing with a minor crisis. James, who had happened to be walking past the side of the house where Marcus was standing, had heard enough of the call to understand it was not a work colleague and was not a minor crisis, but was instead the particular, intimate register of a conversation between two people who are in a relationship with each other and one of whom needs to be managed because the situation is requiring more concealment than that person is comfortable with. James had walked past without stopping. He had returned to the party. He had looked at me across the garden, talking to my aunt, entirely unaware of what was happening 30 feet away, and he had made a decision that I understand now even though it frustrated me initially when I learned of it. He had decided not to tell me that day. Not because he was protecting Marcus, not because he was uncertain about what he'd heard, but because he had looked at my face and understood that I was not in a place where receiving this information would be useful rather than simply devastating, and that what I needed was to arrive at it myself. I was waiting for you to see it, he told me, later. Not because I wanted you to go through more of it than necessary. But because you needed to be the one who knew, not the one who was told. I understand this. I understood it even in the moment when he explained it, even though there is also, sitting alongside the understanding, a small complicated thing that will probably always be there, the knowledge that he knew for 5 months before I did. Marcus had chosen Christmas Eve for reasons that I was only able to reconstruct afterward, from things he told me during the conversation we eventually had about how everything had ended, and from things I understood independently by thinking about the specific logic of his situation. He had been with this woman, whose name was Claire, for approximately 14 months. In those 14 months, the relationship had developed from whatever it had initially been into something that apparently required, from her perspective, a level of acknowledgement that existing in pure secrecy no longer provided. She had been asking, as best I understand it, for some form of inclusion in his life beyond the purely private, not necessarily for everything to be disclosed, but for some gesture toward legitimacy, some occasion on which she existed in a context that had other people in it. Christmas Eve had been, I believe, Marcus's attempt to provide this gesture in a form he had calculated would be manageable, a family dinner that, in his imagination, meant a small gathering of perhaps 4 or 5 people in a context where Claire's presence could be explained as a friend or a colleague or some category of person whose presence was socially unremarkable. He had not accounted for the full family gathering my parents hosted every year. He had heard me describe it as a family dinner and had apparently not fully processed what family dinner meant in the context of my family, which was 11 people around an extended table with 30-year-old Christmas dishes and candles, and a significance that made it precisely the wrong occasion for the particular introduction he had apparently decided to attempt. He had also not accounted for James. This was, I think now, his most significant miscalculation. Not the size of the gathering, not the Christmas dishes, not the candles or the significance of the occasion. Marcus had spent 7 years developing a comfortable assumption that whatever complications arose in his life could be managed through his particular quality of charm and social fluency, and he had never encountered a situation in which James specifically and directly chose not to be managed. James had been managing his own knowledge for 5 months, quietly and alone, waiting for the moment when what he knew could be useful rather than simply painful. That moment was 7:43 on Christmas Eve. And 5 words were exactly enough. Marcus did not move immediately after James said the 5 words. This surprised me, in the moment, though it perhaps shouldn't have. Marcus's particular brand of social intelligence had always included the ability to pause under pressure, to not react in the first available second but to assess, to calculate, to find the version of response that best served his immediate interests before committing to it. It was a quality I had always admired in him in professional and social contexts and that I now watched operate in a context for which it was entirely insufficient. He looked at James. He looked at me. He looked, briefly, at the table full of people who were looking back at him with varying expressions of shock and understanding and the specific controlled anger that my father had been maintaining since the door opened. And then he looked at Claire, in the red dress, who was now standing approximately 1 step behind him and slightly to his right, and whose expression had completed its transition from the early evening confusion of someone who doesn't yet understand the situation into something considerably more specific. The expression of a woman who now understood exactly what situation she had been brought into and was actively processing the dimensions of how she had been misled about it. "Sarah," Marcus said, turning back to me. Not James, who had issued the 5 words. Me. As though the conversation he needed to have was with me rather than with my brother, as though James were a complication of the scene rather than one of its central facts. I looked at him from across the table with the 30-year-old Christmas dishes between us, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I had nothing to say. Not because I was too distressed to speak, though I was, underneath, in ways I was managing through a specific, unfamiliar numbness that I would only fully feel later, in the days that followed, when the immediate drama had resolved and the actual grief arrived. But because there was genuinely nothing to say that James had not already said more efficiently than I could have. My father stood up. This was the moment the room's equilibrium fully shifted, because my father standing up carried a weight that James standing up, for all its significance, had not entirely carried. My father is not a large man and he is not a loud man, and he has, throughout my life, been the particular kind of quiet authority that does not need to announce itself, the kind that has simply always been present and legible to anyone paying attention. He stood up from his chair at the head of the table with the specific, unhurried deliberateness of someone for whom standing up in this moment was not a reaction but a decision, and he walked around the table to stand beside James. 2 men, father and son, standing between the door and the table, which was the geography of the room saying something about alignment that didn't require translation. Marcus looked at both of them. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," he said. And the sentence, which was perhaps the most extraordinary sentence he had produced in the entire duration of our 7-year marriage for the specific quality of its inadequacy to the moment, landed in the room with the particular, flattening effect of a statement so comprehensively wrong for its context that it produces a species of silence that is different from ordinary silence, a silence with texture to it, with the specific quality of 11 people simultaneously deciding not to respond. to something because responding would require treating it as though it deserved a response. James did not respond to it. My father did not respond to it. I did not respond to it. Claire responded to it. She turned and looked at Marcus with an expression that had completed its journey from early confusion through dawning understanding and arrived at something that I recognized, even in the chaos of that evening, as genuine anger, the specific, personal anger of someone who has understood that they have been used as an instrument in a situation that was misrepresented to them, that whatever she had been told about this evening and what it would involve, the reality of 11 family members around a Christmas table and a wife who had clearly not been informed of her planned introduction had not been part of the description. "This is a family Christmas dinner," she said, and the sentence was directed at Marcus with the flat, contained quality of someone stating something obvious that they need to hear acknowledged. "Claire," Marcus said. "You told me it was a small thing," she said. "You told me. This isn't the time." "When exactly?" Claire said, and her voice carried the specific, cold clarity of someone who has decided that their own dignity requires them to speak regardless of the timing. "Would be the time, Marcus. Because I've been waiting for you to find a time for 7 months, and it seems like the time keeps being not now." This sentence rearranged the room again. Because what it contained, beyond the immediate anger of someone who had been misled about this specific evening, was the larger disclosure of a woman who had apparently been waiting, for 7 months, for some form of acknowledgement that had been repeatedly deferred, who had apparently been told by Marcus, over and in various formulations, that the time would come when things would be addressed but that the time was not yet. 7 months of being told the time was not yet, and then being brought to a Christmas Eve family dinner as the apparently final gesture toward the acknowledgement she'd been waiting for. My mother, who had been sitting closest to me throughout all of this, put her hand over mine on the table. She didn't say anything. She just placed her hand over mine, which was the specific, wordless language of a mother who is both present with her daughter's pain and too controlled by the severity of the situation to find words that are adequate to it. Stephanie, my cousin, had pushed back from the table slightly, the reflexive physical adjustment of someone who needs a small amount of additional space to process something significant. My Aunt Carol was looking at Marcus with an expression that I would describe, if I were choosing the most accurate word available, as contemptuous, the specific contempt of a woman in her 60s who has seen several versions of this particular story across a lifetime and finds each new iteration no less offensive for its familiarity. It was my Aunt Carol who spoke next, which I had not anticipated, and whose words cut through the accumulated silence with the specific efficiency of someone who has decided that the social protocols of the room no longer apply. "Young man," she said, to Marcus, in the voice she used when she was about to say something that she had fully committed to regardless of consequences, "you brought your girlfriend to your wife's family Christmas dinner. I'm not sure what outcome you were expecting, but I suspect it was not this one. I recommend you take your brother's advice." "He's not her brother," Marcus said, reflexively and pointlessly. "He is her brother," my aunt said, with a patience that was more devastating than impatience would have been. "And this is her family's home. And you are standing in it with another woman on Christmas Eve. The exit is behind you." Marcus looked at me again. He had been looking at me in intervals throughout this entire scene, and each time he looked I had been looking back, and I think he had been reading, in my expression, something that I was not consciously performing but that was simply the honest external version of what was happening inside me, which was not, or not primarily, the explosive grief that he might have anticipated or the dramatic confrontation that this moment's staging might have predicted, but something quieter and more final. The specific expression of someone who has arrived at a threshold they understand they have already crossed. I was not deciding, in that moment, what I was going to do about my marriage. I had already decided, in the 30 seconds between the front door opening and James's 5 words, in a process so rapid and so complete that it had bypassed the ordinary deliberation of decision-making and arrived directly at its conclusion. I had looked at my husband in the doorway with another woman and I had understood, in the specific way you understand things that you have been approaching slowly for a long time, that the version of the marriage I had believed I was in had never existed in the form I believed it to exist, and that the grief of that understanding was going to take a very long time and would not be available to me tonight, but that the decision itself was already made. What I said to Marcus, in the complete silence of that room with my mother's hand over mine and James and my father still standing by the door and Claire in her red dress looking at him with 7 months of deferred acknowledgement behind her eyes, was considerably simpler than anything the situation's complexity might have warranted. I said, "James is right." That was all. 3 words, against his 5, and the arithmetic of the evening was complete. Marcus looked at me for a moment longer, and I watched him do the specific calculation of a man who has exhausted all available social leverage in a room and is arriving at the understanding that the exit is, in fact, the only remaining direction. He looked at Claire. She looked at him with an expression that communicated, without any ambiguity, that she was not leaving with him, that whatever conversation they needed to have about the 7 months of deferral and the Christmas Eve and the description of a small thing that had turned out to be a family dinner with 11 people and 30-year-old dishes, that conversation was not happening tonight and was not happening in public and was certainly not happening as a joint exit from the house he had just been asked to leave. Marcus left alone. He walked back through the front door that he had walked through at 7:43 with Claire on his arm and the confidence of someone executing a plan, and he walked out of it at approximately 7:58, alone, into the December night, without a plan, without his coat. He had taken it off when he came in and left it on the hallway chair, a detail that I noticed and that seemed, in the specific way that small details become significant in large moments, like an accurate emblem of how thoroughly this evening had not gone as he intended. The door closed behind him. The room held another of its silences, this one different from the previous ones, not the silence of anticipation or shock, but the specific exhale of a room that has witnessed something reach its conclusion. Claire was still standing in the hallway. She looked at me, and in her expression I saw something complicated that I had not expected to see and that I have thought about many times since, not guilt, exactly, or not only guilt, but something closer to the specific, mortified understanding of a person who has just fully comprehended the geometry of what they've been participating in and finds it considerably more painful to see clearly than it was to see partially. "I didn't know it would be like this," she said. I looked at her for a moment. And then I said something that I had not planned to say and that surprised me even as I was saying it. "I believe you," I said. "I think neither of us knew what we were actually in." She nodded, once, and then she left. And the 11 of us sat around the table with the 30-year-old Christmas dishes and the food still warming in the kitchen and the candles still burning, and after a moment that contained everything the evening had been, my mother stood up and said, with the specific, pragmatic love of a woman who has been making Christmas work through difficult circumstances for 30 years, "I'm going to bring the food out." And somehow, extraordinarily, we ate. The days after Christmas Eve had a quality I hadn't anticipated, which was that they were, in certain specific ways, quieter than the days before it. This sounds wrong, I know. The days before Christmas Eve had been ordinary days, work, errands, the particular low-grade busyness of the pre-holiday period, while the days after it contained a divorce, a separation, the practical dismantling of a 7-year shared life, conversations with lawyers and friends and my mother that each required their own significant emotional resources. By any external measure, the days after should have been louder, more demanding, more exhausting than anything that preceded them. But there is a specific quality to the quiet that arrives when something you have been carrying without fully knowing you were carrying it is finally put down, and that quality was present in those early days after Christmas Eve in ways that I found, amid everything else, genuinely unexpected and genuinely sustaining. I had been carrying the weight of not knowing for 18 months. Not knowing, and almost knowing, and choosing not to fully know, and managing the specific cognitive labor of maintaining a life built on a version of reality that was increasingly inconsistent with what the available evidence suggested. That labor, which I had not fully recognized as labor while I was performing it, stopped on Christmas Eve when Marcus walked through the door with Claire, and its cessation produced a quiet that was not peace exactly but was the specific relief of no longer having to hold something in a position that required continuous effort. Marcus called 3 times on Christmas Day. I did not answer. He sent a text that was 4 paragraphs long and that I read once, in the morning, and did not reread, because rereading it would have required giving its particular combination of explanation and apology and self-justification the sustained engagement it was apparently designed to elicit, and I had made a decision. Sometime during the night of Christmas Eve after we had eaten and the family had stayed later than anyone planned and James had finally driven me home and walked me to my door in the specific way he walks me to my door when he is ensuring I'm okay without asking me to confirm it out loud, that I was not going to give Marcus's explanations the engagement they requested. I called a lawyer on the 27th of December, 3 days after Christmas Eve, which felt, even as I was doing it, like a remarkably practical action for someone in the first week of understanding that their marriage was over. My mother's closest friend was a family lawyer, and she had given me her direct number at some point years earlier with the particular quiet of someone who was offering something they hoped would never be needed. I had kept the number in my phone. I called it on the 27th. The process that followed was not simple and was not quick, because the processes involved in ending 7 years of shared life are neither simple nor quick regardless of how clear the decision feels in the immediate aftermath of the thing that makes the decision. There were financial entanglements, shared property, the particular complexity of 2 people who have been building a life together and now need to carefully separate what belongs to each of them from what belongs to the construction they were building jointly. I am not going to walk you through the details of the divorce, partly because those details belong to a private and ongoing process and partly because I think they are less interesting, for the purposes of this story, than what happened in the relationships that surrounded it. My relationship with James changed after Christmas Eve in a way that I find difficult to describe without either understating or overstating it. We had always been close, in the specific, uncomplicated way I described earlier. But the Christmas Eve and what preceded it, the 5 months he had known, the specific calculation he'd made about waiting until the moment when what he knew could be useful, the 5 words, had introduced a new dimension to our relationship that was not more closeness exactly, because we were already close, but something closer to a different quality of understanding. He told me everything, in the days after Christmas Eve, that he had been holding for 5 months, the fragment of the phone screen he'd seen at our dinner table, the conversation through the side of the house at the summer barbecue, the other small observations he'd assembled into a picture he was certain of but hadn't been ready to deliver. He told me with the specific precision of someone who has organized information carefully and is now presenting it as completely as he can, and I listened with the specific quality of attention that comes when you are finally receiving something you've been unconsciously waiting for. Why the 5 words? I asked him, at some point during one of these conversations. Why not more? Why not a whole speech about what you knew? He thought about this for a moment. Because more words would have been about me, he said. About what I thought and what I'd observed and what I'd decided. 5 words was just about the situation. Just about what needed to happen next. You didn't need my analysis. You needed the door to open and him to go through it. I have thought about this answer many times since he gave it. I think it is, among the many things James has said to me that I've found genuinely clarifying, the most accurate description I've heard of what good intervention in someone else's crisis actually looks like, not a comprehensive deployment of everything you know and everything you think, but the specific, minimal action that opens the next door without determining what happens beyond it. He had given me the door. What I did with it was mine. What I did with it, in the months that followed, was something that looked from the outside like the ordinary processes of a woman rebuilding after a difficult marriage, therapy, which I had started in January and which was useful in ways I hadn't entirely anticipated, the specific reorientation of attention that comes from regularly engaging with a professional whose only interest is in your actual well-being rather than in any version of events that serves their own position. Practical rebuilding, finding my footing in a life whose shape had changed significantly. Slowly reconstructing a social world that had been partly organized around a couple that no longer existed. What it felt like from the inside was something more specific and more interesting than rebuilding. It felt like the particular process of recovering yourself after you've been, for an extended period, partly occupied with managing someone else's version of reality and partly occupied with the labor of not fully seeing what was happening. And the recovering involves not just finding your footing in new circumstances but also a kind of retroactive re-examination of who you were and what you were doing during the years you were inside the thing you're now outside of. I found, during this process, things I hadn't expected to find. I found that I was, underneath the grief and the anger and the specific mortification of understanding how long I had been maintained in a false situation, someone with more clarity about what I wanted from a life and a relationship than I'd had before any of this happened. Something about having the floor removed from under a version of your life produces, if you're willing to look at what's actually there, a quite specific and useful set of understandings about what the floor was actually made of and what you'd prefer the next floor to be made of. I found that my friendships, several of which I had allowed to contract during the years of my marriage in the ordinary way of friendships that accommodate the gravity of a long partnership, were available to be recovered with a warmth and generosity that I found genuinely moving, the specific willingness of people who care about you to simply be there when you return to them, without requiring explanation for the years of partial availability that preceded the return. I found that the family Christmas, which I had assumed would become a complicated, freighted occasion permanently altered by what had happened during it, became, by the following year, something closer to what it had always been, extended and slightly chaotic and full of the ordinary overlapping conversations of people who have known each other for their entire lives and have enough history to talk about indefinitely. The 30-year-old Christmas dishes were brought out again. The table was extended with the same additional leaf. James was there, and my parents, and my Aunt Carol, who repeated her assessment of the previous year's events with the specific relish of a woman who had said something well and was not disinclined to acknowledge it. Marcus and I finalized the divorce approximately 10 months after Christmas Eve. The process was, in the end, relatively uncomplicated, not emotionally. Nothing about it was emotionally uncomplicated, but practically, which I attributed partly to the lawyer my mother's friend had connected me with and partly to the specific quality of Marcus's guilt, which appeared to have produced in him a willingness to be reasonable about practical matters as a form of managing feelings he apparently found difficult to inhabit. He remarried, I eventually learned through mutual friends, though not to Claire, whose 7 months of deferred acknowledgement apparently had not survived the particulars of that Christmas Eve. This information arrived without producing the strong reaction in me that I might have expected, which I took as a fairly reliable indicator of where I actually was in relation to the whole thing. I am not remarried. I am not in a relationship, as of the time this is being told, though I am open to one in the specific way that I think I am available to one now in a way I was not before, available with clearer eyes and clearer understanding of what I'm actually looking for and what I'm not willing to settle for, which I believe makes the prospect of a relationship more rather than less likely to be genuinely good rather than simply something that functions on the surface while harboring inconsistencies underneath. I think about Christmas Eve often, the specific sequence of it, the clock at 7:43, the door opening, the woman in the red dress, the 30-year-old dishes, James's 5 words and the absolute silence of a room that had collectively stopped breathing. I think about how many different ways that evening could have gone. If it had been a smaller gathering, as Marcus had apparently anticipated. If James had not been there. If James had been there but had chosen, as he had chosen for 5 months previously, that the moment was not yet right. If Claire had not said, with the specific dignity of a woman who had waited 7 months for something and found what the waiting had produced, that she had been told this was a small thing. I think, most often, about the specific quality of James's 5 words, not just what they were but how he said them, the register of certainty without drama, the absolute economy of a sentence that said everything it needed to say without one syllable beyond what was necessary. Get out of this house. There are things that people say in critical moments that become, over time, part of how you understand those moments, phrases that carry the weight of everything that preceded them and everything that followed, that function as a kind of compression of a larger truth into the smallest available form. James's 5 words are that, for me. They are, in the fullest sense, the sentence that ended one chapter and made the next one possible. He came for dinner 2 weeks ago, James, on a Tuesday evening, nothing special, the ordinary frequency of two siblings who live near each other and enjoy each other's company. We cooked together, which we've always done, and we ate and talked about the inconsequential things that people who are genuinely comfortable with each other talk about on Tuesday evenings, and at some point during the meal I told him that I'd been thinking about telling this story, about whether to tell it and how. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Tell it. Not for him and not against him. Just because it's yours." So I have. If you've ever been in a room where someone who loves you said exactly the right thing at exactly the right moment, I hope you've told them what it meant. And if you haven't yet, I hope you do. Leave a comment if this story reached something in you. Tell me about someone who showed up for you when it mattered most. Subscribe if you want to stay. There are more stories like this one waiting.